When we talk about computers these days, we're usually referring to what's called a PC, a personal computer, a computer that comes in basically one of two configurations, a desktop or a laptop system. A desktop is a non-portable system where the actual screen, the display, the monitor, is a separate unit from the computer itself, which is usually this small tower. In a laptop system, the monitor and the computer itself are put together in one portable unit, and whereas with a desktop, the keyboard and the pointing device, the mouse, are attached via cords to the computer, in a laptop, the keyboard and the pointing device, a trackpad, are built onto the computer itself. So it's all one physical portable unit. The term hardware simply refers to any physical component of a computer system. If you can hold it in your hand, it's hardware. Software, in contrast, is not physical. Software is simply the instructions which are executed by the computer. What we call a program is just a piece of software. It's some set of instructions for some coherent purpose. Programs can be written to do all sorts of things, but here's the list of what are probably the 9 most commonly used types of programs today. First off, a word processor is simply a program for creating and editing textual documents. A spreadsheet is a program mostly used in business. It presents the user with a grid of rows and columns into which the user can plug data, and then the user can have the spreadsheet perform calculations upon these rows and columns, and also do things like, say, draw charts from this data. When people talk about using the internet, what they're usually really talking about is using a web browser. A web browser displays web pages, which are textual and graphical documents which are retrieved from other computers out there on the internet. By far, web browsing has become the most popular thing to do with a computer. Web browsing probably now takes up over 90% of the time people spend using computers. An email client is a program you use to send and receive email. An email, very simply, is a textual message you send to another user on the internet. An instant messenger is also a program you can use to send textual messages to other people on the internet, but it works a bit differently. Email is like sending a letter. You send it off, and then it sits in the recipient's mailbox until they check their mailbox. With instant messaging, it's expected that the recipient is also running an instant messenger at the time you send the message, and the message then instantly appears in their instant messenger program. The message doesn't sit and wait in a mailbox until they check it later. With most instant messengers, you can't send a message to someone who isn't currently running their instant messenger program. So instant messaging, or IMing as it's called, is more appropriate for immediate conversations. It's more like a chat room. Except the messages are still private, like with email. They only get sent to one recipient. A media player, unsurprisingly, is a program for playing media. And when we say media, we mean mainly video and audio. So say if you put a DVD in your computer and wish to play it, you use a media player to do so. An image editor, of course, is a program for creating and manipulating digital images. By far, the most popular program for this purpose is a program called Photoshop. In fact, Photoshop has been so popular for so long that the word Photoshop has become synonymous with manipulating digital images. So you'll commonly hear people talk about photoshopping an image to mean digitally manipulating that image. Most video these days is now digital, and so it's edited on computers using programs called video editors. Even stuff that's still shot on film these days is edited with video editing software because it's just that much easier to do it in a computer rather than having to deal with all this physical film. And finally, the last type of program to mention, games. And games, of course, run the gamut from the very early video games like Pac-Man and Pong to simple card games like Solitaire, and then today's modern games with complicated 3D graphics. Actually, there's one more important type of program to talk about, and that's what's called an operating system. An operating system is a very different kind of program because it's not one you use to accomplish any particular task. It's a program you use to run other programs. It's the operating system in a modern computer which allows it to run multiple programs at once. When you power on your computer, the first thing it does is it loads the operating system which you have installed on that system. Once the operating system has loaded, you can then use its interface to launch other programs. For the last 2 decades, the most popular operating system to run on PCs has been Microsoft Windows, the latest version of which is called Windows 7, and that was released in 2009. The version before that was called Windows Vista, and the version before that was called Windows XP. Here in 2010, you should be at least using Windows Vista, if not Windows 7. A lot of people are still running Windows XP, even though they really shouldn't, for reasons I'll explain later having to do with security. You generally shouldn't run very old software. The 2 main alternatives to Windows are an operating system called Linux and Apple's operating system called Mac OS X. Linux is interesting because it's an example of what's called free or open source software, meaning that anyone is legally allowed to use, copy, and modify the software. So as a user, that means you don't have to pay for it. Only about 2% or so of users worldwide use Linux on their PC, but Linux otherwise is a very successful piece of software because it's used in all sorts of other devices, like probably your car or your cell phone or your toaster or your cable box or your TiVo. Tons and tons of stuff out there runs Linux, even though it's not very popular on PCs. Mac OS X, in contrast, has become increasingly popular in the last 10 years, and now it accounts for maybe 10% of PCs, at least in the United States. OS X is certainly not free, and in fact, Apple only wants you to run OS X on computers which you buy from them, even though the hardware which Apple sells internally isn't really any different than what you can buy, say, from Dell. The cases are different, and they make their own keyboards and mice, but otherwise it's just the same stuff. However, to stop people from running OS X on hardware which they themselves do not sell, Apple put a check into OS X such that when it loads, it looks for the specific chip, and if your hardware doesn't have this chip, which only Apple sells, OS X will not load. So just be clear what you're paying for when you buy an Apple computer. Apple charges a 30 to 50% premium for the same hardware you can buy from other computer makers, but people pay it because they like Apple's nice shiny case design, but most importantly because they want to run OS X, and the only way they can do it is by buying their computer from Apple. Now, whether you use Windows or Linux or Mac OS X, the user interface is generally about the same in each of them. Many details differ, but the big ideas are really just the same. So while the material I'm about to cover is a bit biased towards Windows, it's for the most part applicable to all 3 different operating systems. So first off, the central concept in the user interface of all of these operating systems is that of a window, which is in fact why Microsoft calls their operating system Windows. The point of a window is that in a modern operating system, we want the ability to run multiple programs at once. And what that means is when you have multiple programs running, each program can't monopolize the entire screen. They need to share screen space. And so the idea is that each program is presented on the screen as its own box, a window. And that window you can move around, and the windows can overlap each other, and you can resize the windows to your liking. And each window has 3 basic components. You have at the top, you have the title bar where it says the name of the program. You have a border around the window, and then you have the content pane, the space where the actual program interface is displayed. So whatever the program wishes to show the user, it gets displayed in the content pane. To interact with these windows, users need a pointing device, and on desktop PCs, that's going to be a mouse. What the user is currently pointing at on screen is represented by a cursor, which is usually just a little arrow, and they move the cursor around by moving their mouse around on the desk. And the typical mouse these days has 3 buttons, a left button, a right button, and a middle button, and the middle button on most mice these days doubles as a scroll wheel. So you could push it in to click that button, or you can actually roll the wheel up and down. By far, the most important button is the left mouse button. It's the one you'll be clicking the most. And if you're right-handed, you should be clicking it with your index finger. If you're left-handed, most mice you can configure so that the buttons are swapped. So what we call the left mouse button is actually the right mouse button. So that's something you may want to do if you're going to be moving the mouse with your left hand. A lot of left-handed users just get used to using the mouse with their right hand, or they simply just learn to click with their ring finger rather than their index finger. In any case, what clicking the left mouse button actually does is really up to what is under the cursor on the screen. When the cursor is over something on the screen which looks like a pressable button, clicking the left mouse button should press that button. For many other things, when you click the left mouse button, what it does is it selects that thing underneath the cursor. And in other cases, clicking the left mouse button simply will change the focus, what's called keyboard focus, to the thing which you click on. And by giving a thing keyboard focus, it means that when you type keys on the keyboard, those keystrokes apply to the thing that's been given focus. For example, when you wish to use the keyboard to interact with a window, you need to make sure that window first has keyboard focus, otherwise your keystrokes aren't going to apply to that window. Some things on screen can be interacted with by clicking and dragging them. To click and drag simply means to click the left mouse button, but hold it down, then move the mouse, and then release the left mouse button. So for example, the thing we use click and drag the most for is to move our windows around and then also to resize them, to make them bigger or smaller. So here I have this single window. I click on its title bar and hold the mouse button down as I move the mouse around. I let go and the window is repositioned. If I then click and drag on the border of the window, I can resize the window. And notice that it matters which edge of the window I click. If I click on the top edge, I can only move the top up and down. If I click on one of the corners, I can move that corner in and out, and so forth. Now, if you look at the screen in Microsoft Windows, you'll notice usually at the bottom of the screen, there's this thing we call the taskbar. And on the right side of the taskbar, you should see a display of the current time, and on the left side of the taskbar, you should see a button which you can click to open what's called the Start menu. In earlier versions of Windows, this button was actually labeled Start, but in more recent versions, in Windows Vista and Windows 7, it's just a Windows icon. As we'll get into later, the Start menu is what you use to start programs. For now, we're just going to look at the taskbar itself. The idea of the taskbar is that for every window you have open, there's a button representing that window on the taskbar. So here, because we have a Microsoft Word window and a Photoshop window, there are buttons on the taskbar representing each of them. When you click on the window itself, you bring that window forward and you give it keyboard focus. But another way to do this is not by clicking on the window itself, but by clicking on the button that represents that window on the taskbar. This alternative method of bringing a window forward is very important because sometimes you might have a window which is totally obscured by other windows, so there's no way you can click on it. You need to go to the taskbar to click on its button to bring it forward. The area of the screen which is not the taskbar and which is behind the windows is called the desktop surface, or just simply called the desktop. Rather than leaving this as just a boring blank solid color, a lot of people like to put an image on their desktop, what's called a wallpaper, and on the desktop itself, but behind all of the windows, you might have some number of icons. These icons, as we'll discuss in the next unit, are really just files. But for now, we won't say anything more about files, icons, or the desktop. In the top right of every program window, you should see these three buttons in this order. On the left, there's the Minimize button, in the middle, there's the Maximize, Demaximize button, and on the right, there's a Close button. The Close button, not surprisingly, closes the window. It gets rid of the window and it exits the program and makes the program stop running. The Maximize window puts the window into a special state where it covers the whole desktop area and it's on top of all the other windows. And to get it out of the state so that it's a resizable and movable window again, you have to then click the same middle button to demaximize the window. And finally, to minimize a window means to hide the window such that the only way to get it back, to make it reappear, is to click on its button on the taskbar. So here I click the Minimize button, the window goes away. I go down to the taskbar to click its button and it reappears. I hit the Maximize button and now it's taking up the whole screen area except for the taskbar. I click the button again and it restores back to a regular window which I can move around. and then if I hit the close button, the window then goes away, and here I click the close button on this other window and it goes away too.